Recognition. It is important to remember that the evolutionary benefits of altruism are not necessarily limited to members of the altruist's immediate family, who would be well known and easily recognizable to her or him. Conceivably, help that is given to any genetic relative, e.g., a cousin, could affect the incidence of the altruist genes in subsequent generations. Thus, for kin-based altruism to be evolutionarily successful, potential altruists must be able to recognize, consciously or unconsciously, who their kin are. If altruism is directed too often at non-kin at the expense of kin, the selection mechanism presented, Box 2.1, will not work. Nevertheless, it is not always easy to identify more distant kin from non-kin. Recall the last time you attended a large social gathering, such as a wedding, that included many close and distant relatives and many non-relatives. How many times did you need to be reintroduced to your genetic kin? How then can altruists spontaneously recognize their kin? One possibility is that there may be biological cues. J. Philip Rushton and his associates, e.g. Rushton, Russell, and Wells, 1984, proposed that there is an innate basis for the ability to recognize that another individual is genetically similar, and this ability underlies both kin and reciprocity selection. Among animals, there is evidence to support the Rushton et al. Claim. For example, Legou, Seb, and Porter, 2004, found that 4-week-old lambs could distinguish between the bleats of their siblings and those of unrelated lambs. In addition, many animals can specifically recognize genetically related individuals using smell, appearance, or some other observable characteristics. It appears that humans may also have this ability. Porter, 1987, for example, new mothers can pick out pictures of their own infants from a set of pictures within a few hours after birth, even when there has been very little contact with the infant and only portions of the infant's faces, e.g. their eyes or mouths, were shown to the mothers. Unrelated individuals presented with pictures of mothers and infants could also match them with above-chance accuracy, indicating that there is a detectable resemblance between mothers and their babies as early as the second day of life. Porter, 1987, odors, such as those on t-shirts just worn by an infant, are also reliable recognition cues for humans. Social cues. Social cues may also be important for reciprocal altruism. For reciprocal altruism to work, it is important that individuals bearing the reciprocity gene be matched with each other. Humans and other animals must therefore be equipped with strategies and abilities for recognizing other altruists when they meet them. Similarity may provide the cue, that is, individuals may infer that others who are similar to them in appearance or personality may also be similar to them genetically. Thus, altruists should be more inclined to help others who are similar to them. As we shall see in the next chapter, strangers regularly exhibit this tendency. Furthermore, even within families, helping is more common among members who are more similar in personality, suggesting that there may be a genetic basis for the finding that people prefer to help similar others. Summary. To summarize, the current state of evolutionary perspectives on altruism, animal, social psychological, cross-cultural, and behavioral genetics research provides convergent evidence for a genetic or inherited basis for altruism. Around the world, reciprocity is the norm. When people are unable to reciprocate, they experience negative emotions that minimize the likelihood that they will tolerate cheating. Furthermore, people are more likely to offer help to others with whom they are more closely related. Consistent with the old adage, with respect to altruism, blood is thicker than water. Also, the closer the degree of the relationship, the thicker the blood appears to be. Although selfishness certainly has survival value, so does altruism. There are mechanisms for the genetic transmission of altruistic tendencies from one generation to another. The coexistence of both tendencies in our genetic heritage is not a logical or natural contradiction. We may want to reconsider exactly what is meant by the notion of survival of the fittest. Contrary to how most people might define the term, fittest does not necessarily mean strongest or toughest. sometimes fittest, refers to being the smartest or most sociable, or simply possessing some special physical characteristic that allows an organism to get more food, to avoid predators, or to adapt to threatening environmental conditions. As this relates to our present discussion, sometimes competition and selfishness are needed. At other times, cooperation and altruism are more beneficial. The next logical question is, how are these genes expressed? From genes to actions. Unlike many other animals, humans engage in few, if any, rigidly controlled, highly stereotyped behaviors that can be directly tied to their genetic heritage. That is, we have few instincts. Behaviors like alarm calls in birds, or the suicidal altruistic responses of worker bees when their hive is threatened, are simply not found in humans. So how would such a gene for altruism operate? How can genetic tendencies be translated into action? As we suggested at the beginning of this chapter, genes likely influence human behavior in an indirect manner. They may affect some part of the nervous system and predispose people to be especially sensitive to certain aspects of their environment, e.g., loud, unexpected cries, or to experience certain emotions. The parts of the human brain that govern emotions, the limbic system, evolved earlier than the relatively recent neocortex, which is more involved with cognition and judgment. Thus, emotion might provide a mechanism through which genes can produce altruistic actions. As we show in Chapter 4, a range of emotions, such as guilt, sadness, distress, and concern, can motivate helping and altruism in humans. The capacity to experience sympathetic emotions in response to another person's problem or distress might therefore be the key element linking genetic predispositions to immediate action. In this section of the chapter, we discuss the evidence for a genetic or biological basis of a particular emotional response, empathy, that has been shown to have important implications for helping and altruism in humans. There are two major reasons why empathy has attracted so much interest as a possible link between genes and altruistic actions. The first and most important is that there is a substantial relationship between the ability to experience empathy and willingness to engage in prosocial behaviors. For example, Nancy Eisenberg and her associates, 1990, reported that the more empathic children were, the more likely they were to act prosocially. A similar relationship is found among adults. Empathy plays a critical role in adults' decisions to offer or not to offer help. One accepted measure of empathy is vicariously induced physiological arousal, e.g., changes in heart rate in response to another person's distress. Several studies have found that changes in heart rate predict how likely it is that people will help and the speed with which they help. DeVideo et al., 1991. Thus, across a wide range of people and situations, empathy is a critical element in helping. Although there does appear to be a consistent relationship between empathy and helping, this relationship, in and of itself, does not prove that biological factors are responsible for altruism. As we discuss in Chapter 6, people's learning experiences as they grow up can and do dramatically affect how likely they are to experience empathy when another person is in trouble. Therefore, additional convergent evidence is needed to place empathy in a biological context. The second reason why we illustrate this process with empathy is that, as mentioned earlier, there appears to be a specific part of the brain that gives humans the physiological or neurological capacity to empathize with other people. The portion of the brain that appears to enable a person to be emotionally involved with other people is called the limbic system. This brain structure was present very early in human evolutionary history, McLean, 1973. Indeed, it may have been present among the earliest mammals over 180 million years ago. Therefore, even our most primitive ancestors may have had the capacity for empathy. Empathic responses can lead to altruistic actions, and, according to modern evolutionary theory, altruistic actions may have considerable value in the survival of some gene pools or kinship groups over others. Therefore, empathy could have increased the likelihood that certain kinds of humans survived and continued to evolve into increasingly complex forms as their neocortex developed and grew. Hoffman 2000. More recently, some theorists have argued that the neural basis for empathic and prosocial actions may not be confined to the limbic system. For example, Preston and DeWall 2002 suggested that so-called mirror neurons, neuronal cells that code the actions of other people, enable humans to understand and imitate the actions of others and also give us the ability to empathize with others' emotional state. They further argued that empathic reactions are more or less automatic responses to other people. And perhaps most interestingly, Preston and DeWall claimed that the human tendency to help others is the result of the evolutionary advantages conferred on those who responded to the emotions of others. That is, Preston and DeWall argued that although helping our relatives benefits our inclusive fitness, it is really a byproduct of a more basic human attribute, a highly adaptive nervous system organization. A somewhat similar argument was made by Buck 2002, who suggested that the left hemisphere is more strongly associated with prosocial emotions and feelings than is the right hemisphere. He further argued that these emotions facilitate positive communication among members of a species and result in cooperative exchanges that provide an evolutionary advantage to the parties to such interactions. Buck thus proposed that communicative genes, rather than kin selection or reciprocal altruism, underlie genuine altruism. Both of these new theories of the neural basis of empathy and prosocial actions are intriguing, but at present they are theories that have numerous critics among neuroscientists, evolutionary psychologists, and developmental and social psychologists. It may be some time before we will know whether these theories can really challenge the traditional evolutionary explanations of the origins of prosocial actions, but the works of Preston and DeWall and Buck do give further strength and support to the argument that there is a neural basis for empathy. We now consider how a predisposition to altruism might develop in humans through this mechanism. In particular, we apply two of the approaches for obtaining evidence for the genetic basis of altruism that we described earlier in this chapter, studies of behavioral genetics and early development. The heritability of empathy. As discussed earlier, behavioral geneticists are often interested in assessing the heritability of characteristics. One basic tool in this approach, which has been used in the study of empathy, is the twin study methodology. If identical twins are more alike on some characteristic than fraternal twins, even though they share the same environment, this may be taken as evidence of heritability. As explained earlier in this chapter, heritability is the percentage of the differences that exist among people, or variability in some characteristic that may be due to heredity. In one study using the twin methodology, 71% of the variability in empathy in response to others' distress was found to be due to genetic influences. Matthews, Batson, Horn, and Rosenman, 1981. In another study, Rushton and his colleagues administered a self-report measure of empathy to about 600 adult identical twins and 800 adult fraternal twins. They estimated the heritability of empathy in their subjects to be about 50%. That is, about half of the differences between the empathic tendencies of their subjects was attributable to genetic effects. More recent research, e.g. Davis, Luce, and Krauss, 1994, produced similar but less dramatic estimates of the heritability of empathic tendencies. Davis and his colleagues gave 509 pairs of identical twins and 330 pairs of fraternal twins questions that measured positive affect empathy, feelings of compassion and concern for unfortunate others, negative affect empathy, feelings of personal discomfort and distress in response to distress in others, and cognitive empathy, the ability to see things from another person's perspective. For both kinds of affective empathy, Davis et al. Found larger correlations between the scores of the identical twins than the fraternal twins. Again, we see evidence that heredity plays a role in affective empathy. However, the Davis et al. Estimates of the heritability of affective empathy were lower than those obtained in Rushton studies, 0.28 for empathic concern, and 0.32 for personal distress versus 0.50. Furthermore, on the measure of cognitive empathy, or perspective taking, the differences between identical and fraternal twins were not significant, suggesting that genetic factors are not responsible for individual differences in this kind of empathy. In an earlier study, Zan Waxler, Robinson, and Ems, 1992, observed and recorded displays of positive and negative affective empathy in 14-month-old identical and fraternal twins, then observed them again when the twins were 20 months old. The researchers concluded that at 14 months, about 30% of the differences in the children's empathic tendencies were inherited. However, Zan Waxler et al. Found that the heritability of empathy had declined somewhat by the time the children were 20 months old. In fact, the heritability estimate for negative empathy was no longer significant. These findings underscore something we noted earlier in this chapter. The fact that a behavior has a genetic component does not necessarily diminish the importance of environmental and social influences. Indeed, as we pointed out, environmental influences and socialization forces can override genetic contributions, even before a child is 2 years old, as the Zan Waxler et al. Work demonstrated. The development of empathy. A second technique for assessing genetic influence on prosocial responses such as empathy involves studying the development of empathy beginning at birth. At birth, the influence of the environment outside the womb and of socialization is minimal. Examining the development of empathy illuminates the interplay of genetic and environmental influences. Precursors of empathy. Consistent with the view that empathy is a mechanism by which people's altruistic nature is expressed, empathy-like reactions have been observed in humans at very early ages. Beginning over 80 years ago, researchers found that 4-month-old babies would cry when they heard other children cry, Arlett 1930, Humphrey 1923. These findings suggested an innate capacity to empathize, although one could quite reasonably argue that 4-month-old infants could have already learned to associate distress in others with distressful circumstances for themselves. However, research has found vicarious crying in infants as young as 1 day old. Martin and Clark, 1982. For example, Martin and Clark exposed 1-day-old infants to tape recordings of 3 different sounds: another newborn crying, an 11-month-old child crying, and the child's own crying. The tape that elicited the most crying in babies was the one that contained the sound of another newborn crying. In fact, it produced more crying than the sound of the child's own crying. Of course, these studies of newborns crying do not conclusively prove empathy is an innate emotional process. Even children this young are capable of learning simple associations, and they may have already learned to associate distress in others with unpleasant consequences for themselves. Hoffman, 1978. Infants could also simply be reproducing a sound they have heard. Thompson, 1987. In any case, one must still be impressed with the fact that humans show at least the precursors of true empathy within a day or two after birth. This seems to suggest that, at a minimum, humans are predisposed to be empathic. Developmental trends in empathy. Martin Hoffman is one of the foremost proponents of the idea that there is a genetic basis for human empathy in response to distress in others, which in turn can lead to attempts to help. However, Hoffman, 1978-1990, did not believe that true empathy emerges until an infant has passed through several developmental stages. The first and most primitive stage is global empathy. Hoffman used this term to describe the crying responses in newborns that was just discussed. He argued that during the first year of life, human infants do not have a sense of themselves as unique individuals, separate and distinct from others. They are unable to differentiate themselves from other people. What happens to others, in essence, is happening to them. Hoffman, 1990, provided a clear example of how children respond at this stage of their development. An 11-month-old girl saw another child fall and began to cry. The girl looked as if she was going to cry herself and put her thumb in her mouth and buried her head in her mother's lap, as she does when she herself is hurt. The child's feelings represented some degree of empathy. She understood the other child's pain. Nevertheless, Hoffman argues that this kind of self-centered emotional response, i.e., feeling personally distressed, is not likely to lead to helpful actions toward the other child. By the time children reach about 1 year of age, they are beginning to become aware that they are physically distinct from others, and they have developed a rather rudimentary awareness that other people can be in distress or pain while they are not. But their empathy is still rather self-oriented. That is, they assume that someone in distress feels exactly the same way they would feel if they were distressed, and they also respond accordingly. A typical response for 1 or 2-year-old children who see another child in distress might be to give their own favorite toy or their security blanket to the other child. For example, one child brought his own mother to comfort a distressed playmate, despite the fact that the playmate's mother was nearby. Hoffman, 1978.